Salvatore Moretti pushed open the door of Cafe Paradiso at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 5 minutes later than his usual arrival time, because Lucia had needed help finding her reading glasses. 5 minutes, that changed everything. The cafe smelled like it always did. Espresso, fresh bread, the faint sweetness of almond paste from the morning's cornetti. Antonio Parisi stood behind the counter where he'd stood for 38 years, wearing the same white apron his father had worn before him, preparing Salvatore's usual order before the old man even reached the register. Doppio espresso, extra hot, with a cornetto filled with Nutella. But this morning, Antonio wouldn't meet Salvatore's eyes. "Morning, Antonio," Salvatore said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter, the same stool he'd occupied nearly every morning since 1987, when he'd first established that Cafe Paradiso fell under Moretti protection. "Don Salvatore," Antonio replied, his voice tight. He set the espresso and cornetto in front of Salvatore with hands that trembled slightly. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a white envelope, business-sized, unsealed, with Salvatore's name written in neat block letters on the front. "This came for you," Antonio said. "Left on the doorstep this morning. There were more. For me. For everyone on the block." Salvatore took the envelope, noting the weight of it. Too heavy for just paper. He opened it and found 5 crisp $100 bills and a typed note on expensive cardstock. February protection payment. Returned. Effective immediately. Security services for this address will be provided by Castellano Family Enterprises. Your monthly payment of $500 has been returned as a courtesy. No further payments to previous providers are necessary or expected. You are under Castellano protection now. Sleep well. VC. Salvatore read the note 3 times, his coffee cooling untouched beside him. 23 businesses on this block. If everyone received an envelope like this, that meant the Castellanos had just returned $11,500 in protection money as a gesture of what? Generosity, power, a statement that they were so wealthy they could afford to give away what the Morettis needed to collect. "Antonio," Salvatore said quietly, "did anyone else receive these?" "Everyone," Antonio whispered, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might be listening. "Giuseppe at the butcher shop, Maria at the bakery, the Russos at the pharmacy. Everyone. Don Salvatore, I didn't ask for this. I've been with your family since my father—" "I know," Salvatore interrupted gently. He picked up the $500 bills and slid them across the counter to Antonio. "Keep this. Whatever's happening, it's between families, not between families and shopkeepers who've done nothing wrong." "But the note says—" "The note says you're under Castellano protection now," Salvatore finished. "And maybe you are, but that doesn't change 38 years of your family paying mine for security we provided. If the Castellanos want this block, they'll have to do more than return 1 month's payment." But even as Salvatore said it, he understood the genius of what Victor had done. This wasn't about the money. $11,500 was pocket change to both families. This was about symbolism, about demonstrating that the Castellanos were generous where the Morettis were transactional, about taking territory without violence, without threats, without breaking any of the agreements both families had signed. This was about humiliation. Salvatore stood, leaving his untouched espresso and cornetto on the counter. "Antonio, I need to make some calls, but understand this. Whatever you decide, my family holds no grudge against yours. You do what's best for your business." He walked out of Cafe Paradiso into the grey morning light, pulling out his phone to call Enzo. But before he could dial, he saw them. White envelopes on doorsteps all along the block. The dry cleaner, the hardware store, the bodega, the flower shop. Every business that had been under Moretti protection, marked with a white envelope like a calling card. 23 envelopes, 23 businesses. And Salvatore had discovered it only because he'd been 5 minutes late to his coffee. The war had started while he was helping his wife find her reading glasses. When Salvatore arrived home 30 minutes later, he found Lucia in the kitchen making soup in her large pot, the one she always used when she was thinking through a problem that required hours of careful consideration. She looked up as he entered, took one look at his face, and set down her wooden spoon. "Tell me," she said simply. Salvatore laid the envelope on the marble counter, the $500 bills still inside, the typed note with its casual declaration of territorial conquest. Lucia read it carefully, her expression showing nothing, but Salvatore knew that, look, his wife was already calculating moves he couldn't see, planning strategies that operated on timescales he didn't fully understand. 23 businesses, Salvatore said. The entire Roosevelt Avenue commercial corridor. Victor returned all their February payments, announced the Castellanos are providing protection now, and he did it overnight without a single threat or confrontation. Just generosity, making us look like the greedy ones who've been collecting from the neighborhood for decades. Lucia picked up one of the $100 bills, held it up to the light as if checking for counterfeits, then set it down carefully. "Victor is a bear," she said quietly. "Large, powerful, dramatic. When a bear wants to demonstrate dominance, it stands up tall and roars and makes everyone notice how big and strong it is." "That's one way to describe him," Salvatore muttered. "And you are also a bear," Lucia continued, meeting her husband's eyes. "This is your instinct to stand up taller, to roar louder, to demonstrate that the Moretti family is bigger and stronger than the Castellanos, to match his generosity with greater generosity, to take back territory with overwhelming force." "What else am I supposed to do?" Salvatore asked. "Let him steal our businesses without response? Watch him carve up Corona block by block while we sit here making soup?" Lucia smiled, a small secret expression that Salvatore had learned over 48 years of marriage, meant she was about to say something that would change how he understood everything. "You are a bear," Lucia said, "but I am a hummingbird, small, quiet, easy to overlook. But I can fly backward, something bears cannot do. I can hover in one place, something bears cannot do. I can visit every flower in the garden, one at a time, so quickly that nobody notices I've been there until suddenly all the flowers have been pollinated and the garden has changed completely." Salvatore stared at his wife, not entirely sure what she was proposing, but recognizing the tone. The same tone she'd used in 1987 when she'd suggested how to end the Russo family conflict without violence. The same tone she'd used in 2012 when she'd mapped out how to protect the grandchildren during the Castellano War. "What are you planning?" Salvatore asked. "Victor wants to be the bear," Lucia replied. "Tall, dramatic, impossible to ignore, so let him be the bear. Let him stand up and roar and make grand gestures that everyone notices. Let him think he's winning because his displays are larger and louder than yours. And while he's busy being the bear..." Lucia picked up her wooden spoon and returned to her soup, stirring with the careful attention of someone who understood that the best dishes required patience and precise timing. "While he's busy being the bear, I will visit every flower in Corona, one at a time, so quietly that nobody notices, until suddenly the garden belongs to us again, and Victor is standing alone in the middle of it, wondering how that happened." "Lucia, I don't understand what—" "You don't need to understand yet," Lucia interrupted gently. "You just need to trust me, and you need to do something very difficult for a bear to do." "What's that?" "Lose," Lucia said. "Publicly, dramatically. Let Victor think he's destroying your reputation, stealing your territory, reducing you from powerful patriarch to irrelevant old man. Let the neighborhood see you fail to respond to his challenges. Let him become so confident in his victories that he stops paying attention to the small things. Salvatore felt something cold in his chest. You want me to let him humiliate me? I want you to sell the deception, Lucia replied, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Victor needs to believe he's winning, completely, overwhelmingly, so totally that he becomes careless. That's when we strike, not with roaring and standing tall, but with something he'll never see coming because he's too busy. Watching the bear, he's defeated to notice the hummingbird that's been visiting every flower in his garden. Salvatore looked at his wife. 70 years old, elegant in her kitchen apron, stirring soup with the same careful attention she'd applied to raising their children and protecting their family and surviving decades in a world that destroyed most people who tried to navigate it. He'd learned a long time ago that when Lucia said she had a plan, the smartest thing he could do was trust it even when he didn't understand it. How long? Salvatore asked. However long it takes, Lucia replied. 2 weeks, 2 months. However long Victor needs to become so arrogant that he makes the mistake I'm waiting for him to make. And what mistake is that? Lucia smiled again. That secret expression that suggested she saw moves on a chessboard that hadn't even been placed yet. I'll know it when I see it. Until then, you play the defeated patriarch. You let him win every visible battle. And you trust that I'm winning the invisible war he doesn't know I'm fighting. Salvatore nodded slowly. It went against every instinct he had, to accept defeat, to let his reputation be damaged, to watch his territory carved up without dramatic response. But he'd been married to Lucia for 48 years. He knew better than to doubt her when she spoke with that particular certainty. I trust you, Salvatore said. Good, Lucia replied, tasting her soup and adding a pinch of salt. Now go tell Enzo and the others that we're accepting the Castellano's territorial expansion. No retaliation, no dramatic gestures. We're absorbing the loss and focusing on other priorities. They'll think I've lost my mind. They'll think you've lost your nerve, Lucia corrected, which is exactly what I need them to think, because if your own family believes it, Victor will certainly believe it, and when Victor believes you're weak, that's when he'll make his mistake. The wedding was supposed to be neutral, ground. Maria Benedetti, Father Anthony's niece, a sweet 24-year-old who taught second grade at St. Rita's Elementary, was marrying James Chen, whose family ran the best dim sum restaurant in Queens. It was a union that represented exactly the kind of cross-cultural harmony both the Moretti and Castellano families had been publicly championing as evidence of Corona's evolution beyond its insular Italian immigrant past. Both families had been invited. Both families had RSVP'd affirmatively. Both families understood that Father Anthony's church was sacred neutral territory where old grievances were supposed to be left at the door. But Victor Castellano had other plans. The ceremony was at 4 p.m. at St. Rita's. The reception followed at a modest banquet hall on Northern Boulevard, the kind of place that did 5 weddings every Saturday and had plastic flower centerpieces that rotated between events. Maria's family wasn't wealthy. The wedding was being paid for mostly by her parents and partly by contributions from Father Anthony, who'd been saving for years to give his niece the celebration she deserved. The Moretti family arrived at the reception at 5:15 p.m. Salvatore and Lucia, Dominic and Naomi with their children, Marco, without Isabella, who had a work conflict, and Valentina. They brought an envelope containing $2,000, a generous gift that demonstrated the family's affection for Father Anthony and respect for Maria, who'd been one of Valentina's students in the Foundation's tutoring program. They found their assigned table. table 7, near the back of the room, appropriately distant from the head table but still within the main reception area. Standard placement for important guests who weren't immediate family. The Castellano family arrived at 5:45 p.m. Victor and Elena, Nico, Mia, and Gianna. They were dressed impeccably. Elena in a designer dress that probably cost more than the entire wedding budget. Victor in a suit that made every other man in the room look underdressed. But what drew everyone's attention wasn't their clothing. It was the two men following them, each carrying a large, wrapped box tied with elaborate silver ribbon. Victor approached the gift table where modest wrapped boxes and envelopes were stacked in informal piles, the accumulated generosity of 200 guests who'd brought $50 here, $100 there, whatever they could afford to help the young couple start their life together. Then Victor gestured, and his men set down their boxes, each easily 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, directly in front of the gift table, impossible to miss, dwarfing everything else. "Victor," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying a warning tone that suggested she hadn't known about this display. "What?" Victor replied innocently, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Maria deserves the best. Her family has given so much to this community. The least I can do is help set up her new home properly." The room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. Father Anthony stood near the head table, his expression caught between gratitude at Victor's generosity and concern about what this ostentatious display might mean. Maria approached Victor, her wedding dress rustling, her young face showing genuine confusion. "Mr. Castellano, you didn't have to—" "Nonsense," Victor interrupted warmly, taking her hands in his. "Open them later. But I want you to know—" He raised his voice so the entire room could hear. "One box contains a complete kitchen renovation package, professional-grade appliances, custom cabinets, installation included. The other contains furniture for your living room, pieces my Elena personally selected from the same Italian furniture maker who furnished our home." The room erupted in appreciative murmurs. Several guests applauded. Maria looked overwhelmed, tears forming in her eyes. "You're too generous," she managed. "Your father worked on my construction sites for 20 years, Victor said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "He never asked for anything, never complained, never missed a day. This isn't generosity, Maria. This is respect for a family that deserves it." From table 7, Salvatore watched this performance with the cold understanding of someone who recognized exactly what was happening. Victor hadn't just given an extravagant gift. He'd done it publicly, in a way that made his gift the centerpiece of the reception, in a way that made every other gift, including the Moretti's $2,000 cash envelope, look pathetic by comparison. Lucia's hand found Salvatore's under the table, squeezed once. But this wasn't the warning squeeze from previous confrontations. This was something else, reassurance, confirmation, a signal that said, "This is exactly what I expected. Let him have this victory." The reception continued. The Castellanos sat at table 3, closer to the head table than the Morettis, a seating arrangement that Father Anthony certainly hadn't approved, but that someone had quietly changed. Throughout dinner, guests kept approaching Victor to congratulate him on his generosity, to thank him for supporting the community, to tell stories about working with the Castellano family. Nobody approached table 7. Salvatore played his part perfectly. He sat quietly, spoke little, looked smaller somehow, as if Victor's display had diminished him physically. His family noticed. Dominic kept glancing at his father with concern. Marco's jaw was tight with barely suppressed rage. Valentina's eyes showed strategic calculation, recognizing the symbolism of what was happening, but not understanding why her father was accepting it. Only Lucia seemed unconcerned. She ate her chicken marsala with careful attention, complimented the quality of the bread, chatted pleasantly with Naomi about Sophia's upcoming dance recital. To anyone watching, she appeared completely oblivious to the symbolic warfare happening around her. But Salvatore knew better. When Lucia appeared oblivious, that's when she was most dangerous. By 8 p.m., when Maria and James cut their cake, Salvatore had been virtually invisible for 3 hours at a wedding that should have showcased both families' commitment to the community. Victor had turned a neutral celebration into a demonstration of Castellano dominance, and he'd done it with nothing more than expensive gifts and strategic positioning. As the Morettis prepared to leave, earlier than they'd planned before the dancing even started, Salvatore caught Victor's eye across the reception hall. Victor raised his wine glass in a subtle toast, his expression saying everything. "I can outspend you. I can out-generous you. I can make you invisible in your own neighborhood. And there's nothing you can do about it that won't make you look petty and small." Salvatore didn't return the toast. He simply helped Lucia with her coat and walked out of the reception hall into the September night, acutely aware that he'd just lost another battle in a war he didn't understand but was trusting his wife to win. In the parking lot, as they walked to their car, Lucia pulled out her phone and made a brief call. "Teresa? It's Lucia Moretti." "Yes, I know it's late. I wanted to thank you for the beautiful flowers at the ceremony. The arrangements on the altar were exquisite. Listen, I'm planning something for next month, and I'd love your advice about seasonal blooms." "Of course, let's have coffee. Tuesday morning? Perfect. I'll see you then." Salvatore waited until Lucia hung up. "Teresa Castellano? Victor's cousin? You're having coffee with her?" "Of course," Lucia replied calmly, getting into the passenger seat. "Teresa has run the best flower shop in Queens for 30 years. If I'm planning arrangements for Father Anthony's anniversary celebration, she's the obvious person to consult." "Father Anthony's anniversary celebration?" "His 40th anniversary of ordination is next month," Lucia said. "Surely we're going to do something special to honor that. A beautiful mass, a reception, flowers, food, music. The whole community should celebrate." Salvatore started the car, his mind working through what his wife was actually planning. An anniversary celebration for Father Anthony would be... what? Another opportunity for Victor to demonstrate generosity. Another chance to be outspent and outmaneuvered. "Trust me," Lucia said quietly, reading his thoughts. "And keep looking defeated. The bear needs to believe he's won." The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday. Giuseppe Marino, 76 years old, butcher, widower, the man who'd supplied meat to half of Corona for 50 years from his shop on Roosevelt Avenue, had collapsed behind his counter while closing up. His grandson had found him an hour later, unconscious, barely breathing. The ambulance had taken him to Queens General Hospital, where doctors were running tests to determine if he'd had a stroke or a heart attack or something worse. Salvatore learned about it at 6:30 a.m. when Enzo called with the news. By 7:15 a.m., Salvatore was at the hospital with Lucia, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a card expressing the Moretti family's concern for Giuseppe's recovery. They found Giuseppe's room on the 4th floor, followed the sterile hallway to room 417, and stopped dead at the doorway. Victor Castellano was already there. He sat in the chair beside Giuseppe's bed, holding the old man's hand, speaking in quiet Italian that Salvatore could hear but not quite make out. Giuseppe was awake but groggy, his face drawn and pale, an oxygen tube running under his nose. 3 of his grandchildren stood near the window, Angelo, Sophia, and little Marco, all watching Victor with expressions of gratitude and relief. Victor looked up as Salvatore and Lucia appeared in the doorway. "Don Salvatore," he said warmly, standing and crossing to greet them. "How good of you to come." Giuseppe was just telling me how much your family has meant to his over the years. Salvatore looked past Victor to Giuseppe, who gave a weak smile that was impossible to read. Was it genuine appreciation or awkward acknowledgement of Victor's presence? We wanted to check on him, Salvatore said carefully. Giuseppe has been part of our community for decades. When Enzo told me he'd collapsed. Such a terrible scare, Victor interrupted, speaking loud enough for the grandchildren to hear. When I heard what happened, around midnight I think it was, I came straight here. Couldn't sleep knowing Giuseppe was alone and frightened. I've been here most of the night, making sure the doctors understand who he is, what he means to Corona, that he receives the best possible care. Salvatore understood immediately what was happening. Victor had somehow learned about Giuseppe's collapse before Salvatore did, or had arranged to be notified first, and had rushed to the hospital to establish his presence, his concern, his generosity before the Morettis could even wake up. The doctors say it was a small stroke, Victor continued, still speaking to Salvatore, but really performing for the grandchildren. Caught early, minimal damage, excellent prognosis. But Giuseppe will need help during recovery. Physical therapy, home care, modifications to his shop to make it more accessible. We'll make sure he has whatever he needs, Salvatore said, hearing how weak his offer sounded after Victor had already spent the night at Giuseppe's bedside. Already handled, Victor replied smoothly. I've arranged for a private physical therapist. Comes to the house. 5 days a week, fully covered. I've also contracted with a medical equipment company to install proper railings and a ramp at the shop. And since Giuseppe won't be able to work for a few weeks, I've arranged for his monthly expenses to be covered. Angelo Marino, Giuseppe's oldest grandson, early 30s, married with 2 children, stepped forward. Mr. Castellano has been incredibly generous, Don Salvatore. We don't know how we would have managed without... Your grandfather is family, Victor interrupted, waving away the gratitude. We take care of family in Corona. That's what community means. The we hung in the air. Not I take care of family. We. As if Victor spoke for all of Corona now, as if the Castellanos had become the default family that people turn to in crisis. Salvatore looked at Giuseppe, who met his eyes with an expression that carried apology and resignation and exhaustion. The old man had needed help. Victor had provided it. What was Giuseppe supposed to do? Refuse assistance to preserve some abstract loyalty to a family that had taken 3 hours longer to find out he was sick? Giuseppe, Salvatore said quietly, stepping past Victor to the bedside. You rest. You focus on getting better. Whatever you need that isn't covered, you call me directly. Understood? Giuseppe nodded, squeezing Salvatore's hand weakly. Thank you, Don. Salvatore, you've always been good to me. Have been. Past tense. Salvatore heard it, even if Giuseppe hadn't meant it that way. Lucia placed her flowers on the windowsill. They looked modest, next to the elaborate arrangement Victor had already brought, professional, expensive, overwhelming the small hospital room, with their presence. But Lucia's attention wasn't on the flowers. She was studying the grandchildren, particularly Angelo, with the careful focus of someone reading information that others missed. Angelo, Lucia said gently, your grandfather is very lucky to have you nearby. Not every older person has family who can help during recovery. Thank you, Mrs. Moretti, Angelo replied. We're doing our best. I'm sure you are, Lucia continued. It must be difficult balancing your own family with caring for your grandfather. Your daughters are how old now? 8 and 10? Angelo looked surprised that Lucia knew this detail. 9 and 11, actually. Growing fast. I remember when my children were that age, Lucia said warmly. Such a wonderful time, but also expensive. Dance classes, school supplies, birthday parties. It adds up quickly. It does, Angelo admitted. Well, when things settle down with your grandfather, you should bring the girls by my house, Lucia said. I have some beautiful dresses that my granddaughter Sophia has outgrown, barely worn. It would be a shame to let them go to waste when they could go to girls who'd appreciate them. It was such a small gesture, offering hand-me-down dresses. Nothing compared to Victor's grand displays of wealth and generosity. But Angelo's face showed genuine gratitude for the offer, not because the dresses were valuable, but because Lucia had remembered his daughters' names, had thought about their needs, had offered something personal rather than transactional. Victor watched this exchange with barely concealed impatience. This wasn't the kind of generosity that impressed audiences or demonstrated dominance. This was grandmother stuff, domestic, small, irrelevant to the larger game being played. We should let you rest, Lucia said to Giuseppe. Then she turned to Victor with a smile that didn't carry any of the tension Salvatore was feeling. Victor, perhaps we could speak outside for a moment. The two of them stepped into the hallway, leaving Salvatore with Giuseppe's grandchildren and the terrible awareness that he'd lost another symbolic battle. Victor had beaten him to the hospital, provided more comprehensive help, and established himself as the family Giuseppe called in crisis. In the hallway, Lucia and Victor stood near the nurse's station, speaking in voices too quiet for Salvatore to hear through the glass. But he could read body language. Victor's posture confident and relaxed, Lucia's seemingly deferential, almost submissive. She appeared to be thanking him, acknowledging his generosity, perhaps even conceding that the Castellanos were simply better positioned to help the community than the Morettis had ever been. When they returned 2 minutes later, Lucia's expression was neutral, but Victor wore a small smile that suggested satisfaction. "We should go," Lucia said to Salvatore. "Giuseppe needs rest, and we're taking up space his family should occupy." They left the hospital together, Victor walking with them as far as the parking lot, chatting amiably about Giuseppe's recovery timeline and the upcoming community events. He was friendly, respectful, showing no hint that he'd just executed another perfect demonstration of Castellano superiority. Only when they reached the Moretti car did Victor's mask slip for just a second. "Salvatore," he said quietly, "I want you to know, this isn't personal. Giuseppe needed help. I was in a position to provide it, that's all." "Of course," Salvatore replied, playing his role perfectly. "That's all any of this is. Just neighbors helping neighbors." Victor nodded, but his eyes showed something else. "I'm winning. And you know it. And there's nothing you can do about it without looking like the villain who puts pride above an old man's medical care." As Victor walked to his own car, Salvatore turned to Lucia. "What did he say to you in the hallway?" "He asked if we wanted to coordinate our support for Giuseppe," Lucia replied, getting into the passenger seat, "so we weren't duplicating efforts or overwhelming the family with competing generosity." "What did you say?" "I said that sounded very reasonable and community-minded," Lucia said calmly. "Then I thanked him for getting there first and making sure Giuseppe received immediate care. I told him the Moretti family recognized that the Castellanos were simply better positioned to help in situations like this, and that we appreciated his taking the lead in community support." Salvatore stared at his wife. "You told him we're better positioned to help?" "I told him what he wanted to hear," Lucia corrected. "What he needed to believe. That we're accepting our diminished role, that we recognize his superiority, that we're grateful he's taking over responsibilities we can't handle anymore." "But, Salvatore," Lucia interrupted gently, "you said you trusted me. Do you still trust me?" He looked at his 70-year-old wife, elegant even in the harsh parking lot sunlight, her expression showing absolute certainty that she understood exactly what she was doing, even if he couldn't see it yet. "I trust you," Salvatore said. "Good," Lucia replied, pulling out her phone, because I need you to keep looking defeated for a little while longer. Victor needs to become so confident that he stops paying attention to small things, like the fact that Angelo Marino's daughters are 9 and 11, not 8 and 10, like the fact that I knew that without asking, like the fact that I've been visiting families all over Corona for the past 2 weeks, one at a time, so quietly that nobody notices I'm building. Something Victor can't see. As Salvatore drove out of the parking lot, Lucia made 3 phone calls in quick succession. Teresa? It's Lucia. Coffee tomorrow morning instead of Tuesday? Perfect. I have some thoughts about the flower arrangements for Father Anthony's celebration. Yes, I'd love your input on something else too. See you tomorrow. Angela? Lucia Moretti. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about your son's college applications. I think I may have a contact at Columbia who could write a recommendation letter. Of course, let's have lunch this week. Rosa, it's Lucia. Thank you again for the beautiful bread at Maria's wedding. Listen, I'm organizing a women's group to discuss community safety issues, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Thursday evening. Perfect, I'll send details. Salvatore listened to his wife make these calls, each one brief, friendly, personal. Coffee with Victor's cousin, lunch with a local business owner, a women's group meeting with the neighborhood's most influential baker. Small things, quiet things. The kind of activities that wouldn't register as strategic moves to someone watching for grand gestures and dramatic confrontations. The kind of things a hummingbird would do while the bears were busy roaring at each other. How many of these have you been doing? Salvatore asked when Lucia finished her calls. Small visits? Lucia smiled. Every day for the past 2 weeks, sometimes 3 or 4 a day. Coffee here, lunch there, a quick conversation after morning mass. Just a grandmother being social, nothing that would seem strategic to anyone watching for power plays. What are you actually doing? Visiting every flower in Corona, Lucia replied, one at a time, so quietly that the bear doesn't notice the garden is being pollinated until suddenly everything has changed and he's standing in a garden that no longer belongs to him. Father Anthony Romano's 40th anniversary of ordination fell on a Sunday in late September. The celebration had been Lucia's idea. A beautiful mass at St. Rita's, followed by a reception in the church hall, a community gathering to honor the priest who'd served Corona for decades, married its children, buried its dead, and somehow maintained his moral authority even while serving 2 families who'd spent years at war with each other. The planning had taken 3 weeks. Lucia had personally coordinated every detail. Victor Castellano handling the flower arrangements, Rosa Benedetti providing the bread and pastries, Angela Marino organizing the reception setup. A dozen women from Corona had contributed their time and talents, each one personally recruited by Lucia through those quiet coffee meetings and lunch conversations that had seemed so insignificant at the time. Victor Castellano had contributed money, $5,000 donated publicly to help cover costs, announced at the previous Sunday's Mass so everyone would know the Castellanos were supporting this community celebration. It was generous, visible, exactly the kind of grand gesture Victor had been making for weeks. What Victor didn't know was that Lucia had been planning this celebration specifically as the moment when everything would change. The Mass began at 10 a.m. St. Rita's was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls, the church overflowing with the accumulated community of Corona's 40 years under Father Anthony's pastoral care. The Moretti family sat in their usual pews on the left side. The Castellano family sat on the right side. The physical separation of the families was tradition, dating back decades, a visible reminder that even in God's house, some divisions remained. Father Anthony celebrated the Mass with visible emotion. his voice occasionally breaking as he reflected on 40 years of service, 40 years of witnessing the community's joys and tragedies, 40 years of trying to be a moral anchor in a neighborhood where morality often required complicated navigation. The homily was brief but pointed. "I have served this community through wars and peace," Father Anthony said, his voice carrying across the silent church. "I have buried young men who died in violence. I have counseled families torn apart by grudges that lasted generations. I have watched this neighborhood nearly destroy itself through conflicts that benefited nobody and harmed everyone." He paused, looking first at the Morettis, then at the Castellanos. "But I have also witnessed transformation. I have seen enemies become allies. I have seen families choose peace over vengeance. I have seen a community remember that we are all children of the same God, brothers and sisters who share the same streets and the same struggles." "Today," Father Anthony continued, "I want to thank the women who organized this celebration, not the ones who wrote checks, though I appreciate that generosity, but the women who did the work, who made the calls, who coordinated the flowers and the food and the setup. Who understood that community isn't built through grand gestures, but through patient, faithful attention to detail." He gestured toward the altar where elaborate flower arrangements created a stunning visual backdrop. These flowers were arranged by Teresa Castellano, who has run the finest flower shop in Queens for 30 years. The bread and pastries for today's reception were baked by Rosa Benedetti, whose family has fed this neighborhood for 3 generations. The tables and chairs were set up by Angela Marino and her daughters, who spent yesterday afternoon making sure everything was perfect. Salvatore noticed Victor shift slightly in his pew, his expression showing confusion. His $5,000 donation had just been acknowledged second to the women who'd done the actual work. Victor probably hadn't even realized was happening because he'd been focused on the money, the visible contribution, the grand gesture. But mostly, Father Anthony said, "I want to thank Lucia Moretti, who spent the past month visiting every family represented here today, personally inviting them to participate in this celebration, coordinating all the details that transform a church service into a community gathering. Lucia understood something that perhaps we all forget sometimes, that community isn't built by whoever contributes the most money. Community is built by whoever pays the most attention." The church erupted in applause. Lucia remained seated in her pew, not standing to acknowledge the recognition, simply nodding gracefully as people turned to look at her. She appeared modest, humble, uncomfortable with the attention, the perfect image of a grandmother who'd simply wanted to do something nice for her priest. But Salvatore could see something else in his wife's expression. Not triumph, exactly. More like satisfaction that the first move in her endgame had just been executed perfectly. The reception followed in the church hall. Long tables were set up with Rosa's bread and pastries, coffee urns borrowed from the community center, flowers from Teresa's shop creating beautiful centerpieces on every table. It was modest compared to Victor's usual displays. No professional catering, no elaborate decorations, nothing that screamed wealth or power. But it was warm, personal. The kind of reception where everyone knew everyone, where conversations flowed naturally, where the food tasted like home because it had been made by hands that had fed the neighborhood for generations. Victor stood near the coffee urns, looking slightly out of place. He'd worn an expensive suit to a reception where most people had dressed casually after Mass. He'd brought a gift for Father Anthony, an expensive watch that was currently sitting in a box on the gift table, wrapped in paper that probably cost more than most people's entire gifts. Elena stood beside him, her expression showing that she'd recognized something Victor hadn't yet seen. She kept glancing at Lucia, who was moving through the reception hall like a hummingbird visiting flowers, A brief conversation here, a warm greeting there, a gentle touch on someone's arm, a whispered word in someone's ear. Salvatore watched his wife work the room and understood for the first time what she'd actually been building over the past 3 weeks. This wasn't just a celebration for Father Anthony. This was a demonstration. Every person Lucia spoke to responded with warmth, with familiarity, with the kind of easy affection that came from genuine relationship rather than transactional generosity. Victor had been giving money. Lucia had been giving attention. Victor had been making grand gestures. Lucia had been having coffee. Victor had been demonstrating power. Lucia had been building connections. And now, in this church hall filled with the accumulated community of Corona, everyone could see which approach had actually won people's loyalty. Teresa Castellano approached Lucia near the dessert table. The two women embraced warmly, and Salvatore noticed Victor stiffen slightly across the room, his cousin showing public affection for the matriarch of the rival family. "The flowers are beautiful, Teresa," Lucia said, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "You have such a gift for arrangements. Father Anthony was moved to tears when he saw the altar this morning." "I'm just glad I could help," Teresa replied, "and thank you for including me in the planning. It's been wonderful working with you on this." Working with you, not being hired by you, not providing services for payment, working with, as equals, as community members collaborating on something meaningful. Victor started to approach his cousin, perhaps to reclaim her attention, but Elena's hand on his arm stopped him. Salvatore couldn't hear what Elena whispered to her husband, but he saw Victor's expression shift from confidence to confusion to the dawning realization that something had changed in the past 3 weeks, something he'd been too focused on his own victories to notice. Throughout the reception, the pattern repeated. Angela Marino thanked Lucia for helping with her son's college application. Rosa Benedetti consulted with Lucia about a community safety concern. A dozen women, the wives, mothers, daughters, and grandmothers who actually held Corona together beneath the visible power structures, gravitated toward Lucia like flowers turning toward the sun. Victor stood near his expensive gift, increasingly isolated, watching his $5,000 donation mean less with every passing minute than Lucia's 3 weeks of patient attention. By noon, when the reception was winding down, Father Anthony found Lucia near the kitchen, where women were organizing leftover food to be distributed to elderly shut-ins who couldn't attend the celebration. "You did something remarkable today," Father Anthony said quietly, so only Lucia could hear, "not just organizing a celebration, but reminding everyone what community actually means." "I just made some phone calls," Lucia replied modestly. "Nothing remarkable about that." "You made Corona remember that they're a community," Father Anthony corrected. "Not just people who live on the same streets and pay the same families for protection, but actual neighbors who know each other's children's names, who share food when times are hard, who help each other without keeping score of who owes whom." He glanced toward Victor, who was speaking with Nico near the exit, both men looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested they were ready to leave. "Victor has been very generous with his money, but you've been generous with your time. And in the end, time is what people remember." Lucia smiled. "Thank you, Father. That means a great deal coming from you." As the Moretti family prepared to leave, Salvatore noticed something that confirmed his wife had accomplished exactly what she'd planned. People were saying goodbye to Lucia personally. Not just polite waves across the room, but making specific effort to find her, to thank her, to tell her how meaningful the celebration had been. Nobody sought out Victor. In the parking lot, as they walked to their car, Salvatore finally asked the question he'd been holding for 3 weeks. What just happened in there? Victor learned that being a bear isn't enough, Lucia replied simply. He can stand up tall and roar and make grand gestures that everyone notices. But while he was busy being loud and dramatic, I visited every flower in his garden, and now the garden knows who actually tends it. That was your endgame? A church reception? That was the demonstration, Lucia corrected. The proof that what I've been building actually works. Now comes the moment when Victor realizes what he's lost. What's he lost? Lucia smiled. That secret, knowing expression that Salvatore had learned meant she was about to reveal something he hadn't seen coming. Everything that matters. Watch. The call came 3 days after Father Anthony's anniversary celebration. Catherine Castellano, Victor's mother, 92 years old, widow of Dominic Castellano, who'd built the family's construction empire before Victor expanded it into something larger, had died peacefully in her sleep at the nursing home where she'd lived for the past 5 years. She'd been declining for months, her mind fading with dementia, her body gradually surrendering to age. Her death was expected, sad, but not tragic, the natural end of a long life. The funeral was scheduled for Friday morning at St. Rita's, followed by burial at Calvary Cemetery and a reception at the Castellano estate. It would be a significant event. Catherine had been a fixture in Corona for 60 years, had raised 4 children, had watched her family's fortunes rise from modest construction company to major business empire. Both families would attend, obviously. Catherine Castellano's funeral would draw everyone of significance in Corona, plus business associates and family members from across the city. It would be, in many ways, a display of the Castellano family's accumulated power and connections. Victor had insisted on handling every detail personally. No expense would be spared. The flower arrangements would be stunning. The burial plot was in the most prestigious section of Calvary. The reception would be catered by the finest Italian restaurant in Queens. Catherine Castellano would be buried with the honors befitting the mother of a powerful patriarch. What Victor didn't know was that Lucia had been visiting his mother every week for the past 5 years. The morning of the funeral, Salvatore dressed in his best dark suit, the one he reserved for occasions that required demonstrating respect and solemnity. Lucia wore a simple black dress with a pearl necklace, elegant but not ostentatious, appropriate for honoring a woman she'd known for decades. "Are you ready?" Salvatore asked as they prepared to leave. "For what?" Lucia replied calmly. "Whatever you've been planning. This is it, isn't it? The moment when Victor realizes what he's lost?" Lucia smiled. "Victor has already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. Today he'll find out." They arrived at St. Rita's at 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the funeral mass was scheduled to begin. The church was already filling with mourners, family members, business associates, Corona residents who'd known Catherine for decades. The Castellano family hadn't arrived yet. They would enter together just before the service started, walking behind the casket in a formal processional that would remind everyone of the family's significance. The Moretti family found seats in the middle section, not front rows reserved for family, but not back rows either. Appropriate positioning for important community members attending to pay respects. But Lucia didn't sit down. "Where are you going?" Salvatore whispered as his wife moved toward the front of the church. "To sit with Catherine," Lucia replied simply, walking down the center aisle toward the front pews with steady, deliberate steps. Salvatore watched in shock as his wife reached the second row, reserved for immediate family, and settled into a seat directly behind where Victor and his family would sit. She arranged her purse, adjusted her dress, and sat with the calm composure of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. Murmurs spread through the church. People noticed. The Moretti matriarch had just seated herself in the Castellano family section. Not in the back with other community mourners, not in the middle with important guests. In the family section, where only children, grandchildren, and closest relatives were supposed to sit. The Castellano family arrived at 9:55 a.m. Victor led the processional, walking behind his mother's casket with Eleanor beside him. His children followed, Nico, Gianna, and behind them, extended family members. Victor's siblings, Catherine's grandchildren, the accumulated Castellano clan dressed in funeral black. They processed down the center aisle with solemn dignity, every eye in the church watching them, and then Victor reached the front pews and saw Lucia Moretti sitting in his family section. He stopped. For just a moment his funeral procession halted as Victor processed what he was seeing. The Moretti matriarch, in his family's designated seating, at his mother's funeral. But before Victor could say anything, before he could ask Lucia to move or understand what this meant, something else happened that was even more shocking. Teresa Castellano, Victor's cousin, the florist who'd worked with Lucia on Father Anthony's celebration, stood up from her seat in the third row, walked forward and embraced Lucia warmly. "Lucia," Teresa said, her voice carrying in the suddenly silent church. "Thank God you're here. Mother Catherine would have wanted you in the family section. You visited her every week. You were there more than most of her actual grandchildren." And then, while Victor stood frozen in the center aisle, Teresa sat down next to Lucia. Victor's sister, Angela, was next. She rose from the family pews, crossed to where Lucia sat, and took Lucia's hands in hers. "You were so good to our mother," Angela said, tears in her eyes. "All those years in the nursing home when she couldn't remember who anyone was. You still came every week. You talked to her like she could still understand. You brought her those almond cookies she loved. You—" Angela's voice broke. "You made sure she wasn't alone." Angela sat on Lucia's other side. One by one, Catherine Castellano's extended family, cousins, nieces, nephews, in-laws, acknowledged Lucia's presence in the family section with nods, smiles, whispered thank yous. They weren't asking why she was there. They were treating her presence as natural, appropriate, earned through years of attention that most of them had failed to provide. Victor stood in the center aisle, the funeral procession backing up behind him, watching his own family embrace the Moretti matriarch at his mother's funeral. He couldn't ask Lucia to move without looking petty and cruel. He couldn't question her presence without his own relatives explaining that she'd earned that seat through years of visiting his mother when he'd been too busy building his empire to sit with a woman whose mind was fading. Victor had been making grand gestures. Lucia had been visiting an old woman in a nursing home every week for 5 years. Victor had been demonstrating power. Lucia had been demonstrating love. And now, at Catherine Castellano's funeral, everyone could see which mattered more. Victor finally moved to his seat in the front row, his face showing nothing but Salvatore could see the muscle in his jaw working, the slight tremor in his hands as he clasped them together. Elena sat beside him, her expression showing that she understood exactly what had just happened and exactly how badly her husband had been outmaneuvered. The funeral mass proceeded. Father Anthony eulogized Catherine as a woman of deep faith, strong family bonds, and quiet dignity. He spoke about her dedication to her children, her love of her community, her daily rosary prayers, even after her mind could no longer remember why she was praying. And then Father Anthony said something that struck like a knife. In Catherine's final years, when dementia stole her memories, but not her capacity for love, she had faithful visitors who made sure she never felt abandoned. Especially Lucia Moretti, who came every Thursday afternoon for 5 years, brought almond cookies from Rosa's bakery, and sat with Catherine even when Catherine couldn't remember who she was. That kind of faithfulness, showing up week after week with no expectation of recognition or gratitude, that's the truest expression of Christian charity. The church was absolutely silent. Everyone understood what Father Anthony had just said. Lucia Moretti had been more faithful to Victor's mother than Victor had been. After the Mass, the processional to Calvary Cemetery felt different. The Castellano family rode in the lead cars, but something had shifted. Conversations at the cemetery were subdued. The normal displays of family solidarity felt forced, and Lucia remained positioned at the center of the Castellano family section, standing between Teresa and Angela during the burial prayers, visibly present in a way that made her impossible to ignore or dismiss. At the reception at the Castellano estate, Victor's home, his territory, where he should have had complete control, the dynamic continued. The extended Castellano family gravitated toward Lucia, thanking her for her faithfulness to their mother/aunt/grandmother, sharing stories about Catherine that demonstrated Lucia had known the old woman better in her final years than many of them had. Victor stood in his own living room, surrounded by the expensive catering he'd arranged and the business associates who'd come to pay respects, watching his family show more warmth toward the Moretti matriarch than they showed toward him. Salvatore watched all of this from a respectful distance, finally understanding the full scope of what his wife had been building for 5 years. Not 3 weeks, 5 years. Since before the current symbolic war had even started, Lucia had been visiting Catherine Castellano every Thursday, establishing relationships with Victor's extended family, planting seeds that wouldn't bloom until this exact moment. Elena Castellano approached Lucia near the end of the reception. The two women stepped onto the back patio, away from the crowd, and had a brief conversation that Salvatore couldn't hear. When Lucia returned, her expression showed something Salvatore had never quite seen before. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but the quiet completion of something that had required years of patient work. "What did Elena say?" Salvatore asked as they prepared to leave. "She thanked me for being faithful to Catherine," Lucia replied, "and then she asked me to teach her how to be a hummingbird instead of a bear." That evening, back at the Moretti estate, the family gathered for dinner. Everyone was there. Dominic and Naomi, Marco, Valentina, Enzo. They'd all witnessed what happened at the funeral. Lucia's positioning in the Castellano family section. The extended family's warmth toward her. The visible shift in power dynamics that nobody quite understood but everyone had felt. Valentina was the first to ask the question everyone was thinking. "Nonna, what just happened? How did you end up sitting in the Castellano family section at Victor's mother's funeral? How did his entire family treat you like you belonged there?" Lucia set down her wine glass and smiled at her granddaughter. "I made friends with a lonely old woman that everyone else had forgotten about. I visited her every Thursday for 5 years. I brought her cookies. I sat with her even when she couldn't remember who I was. And her family remembered that faithfulness when it mattered most." "But why?" Dominic asked. "Why spend 5 years visiting Victor's mother?" "Because I knew a day would come when Victor would go too far," Lucia replied. "When he'd push too hard, demonstrate his power too dramatically, humiliate your grandfather one too many times. And when that day came, I wanted to be positioned where I could remind everyone what actually matters in a community. Not grand gestures, not expensive gifts, but faithfulness. Attention. The patient work of showing up week after week, even when nobody's watching and nobody's keeping score." "The envelopes," Salvatore said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. 3 weeks ago, when Victor returned the protection payments, That was the moment you were waiting for, wasn't it? Yes, Lucia confirmed. That was when Victor revealed his strategy. Systematic, symbolic dominance. Taking territory without violence, making you look weak and outdated through displays of greater generosity. I recognized the pattern immediately. This would escalate. The wedding gifts, the hospital visits, each one more dramatic than the last. Victor would keep pushing until he'd completely destroyed your reputation and established himself as Corona's unquestioned patriarch. So you let him, Marco said, his voice carrying awe. You let him win every visible battle while you fought a war he couldn't see. A war he didn't even know was happening, Lucia agreed, because bears only pay attention to other bears. They don't notice hummingbirds. Victor was so focused on defeating Salvatore that he never noticed I was visiting every flower in his garden, pollinating relationships he didn't even know existed, building connections that would bloom exactly when I needed them to bloom. The anniversary celebration, Enzo said, quietly. That wasn't just about honoring Father Anthony. That was your demonstration that you'd built a network Victor couldn't match. And the funeral was the kill shot, Valentina added, her strategic mind recognizing the genius of the timing. You demonstrated that you'd been more faithful to Victor's own mother than he had been, in front of his entire extended family. At the moment when everyone was thinking about family bonds and what it means to honor the people you love, you destroyed his credibility with his own relatives. Lucia nodded. Victor can write checks. He can make grand gestures. He can demonstrate wealth and power. But he can't rewrite 5 years of his own absence from his mother's life. He can't compete with someone who showed up every Thursday with almond cookies and sat with a woman who couldn't remember her name. That kind of faithfulness can't be bought or demonstrated through grand gestures. It can only be earned through patient attention over time. So, what happens now? Dominic asked. Victor just loses? Victor has already lost the thing that matters most, Lucia replied. Respect. His own family saw him differently today. They saw a man who was too busy building his empire to visit his mother. They saw a woman from a rival family who was more faithful than he was. That understanding, that shift in how his own relatives see him, that's permanent. He can never undo it. But the businesses, Marco pressed, the territory he took, the symbolic victories he scored, are temporary, Lucia said, because I've spent 3 weeks having coffee with every business owner's wife, every shopkeeper's mother, every family's grandmother. The men make the financial decisions, but the women make the social decisions. And the women of Corona have decided that the Moretti family, specifically that I, understand what community actually means. When those women talk to their husbands about which family to trust, which family actually cares, about Corona versus which family just wants to control it, what do you think they'll say? Salvatore looked at his wife with an expression that mixed love, respect, and the slight fear that comes from realizing you've underestimated someone for 48 years. How long have you been planning this? Since the day we made peace with the Castellanos, Lucia replied. I knew the peace would hold only as long as neither family felt disrespected. I knew Victor would eventually test boundaries. I knew Salvatore's instinct would be to respond with equal force. So I started building insurance. Relationships that could be activated if we ever needed to demonstrate that power isn't just about money and grand gestures. It's about patient faithfulness that nobody notices until suddenly everyone does. She looked around the table at her family. Victor wanted to humiliate Salvatore. He succeeded, at least publicly. But while he was busy making your grandfather look weak, I was demonstrating something more important, that our family understands what Corona actually needs. Not bigger displays of wealth, not more dramatic generosity, but the patient, faithful attention of someone who shows up every Thursday with cookies for an old woman nobody else bothers to visit. "That's terrifying," Valentina said quietly, "and brilliant and completely invisible until it wasn't." "That's how hummingbirds fight bears," Lucia replied. "We don't try to be bigger or louder or more dramatic. We just visit every flower in the garden so quietly that nobody notices until suddenly the entire garden has been pollinated and belongs to us." 3 days after Catherine Castellano's funeral, Lucia received a phone call from Elena requesting a private meeting. They agreed to meet at a neutral cafe in Astoria, not Corona, where everyone would notice and speculate, but far enough away that they could speak freely. Lucia arrived first, ordered a cappuccino, and settled into a corner table where she could see the door. Elena arrived exactly on time, elegant in a charcoal business suit, her expression showing the careful control of someone who'd spent years learning to navigate difficult conversations. "Thank you for meeting me," Elena said, settling into the chair across from Lucia. "Of course," Lucia replied warmly. "I was glad you called." They ordered coffee and spent a few minutes on pleasantries: the weather, upcoming community events, Father Anthony's health, standard social choreography before difficult topics could be addressed. Finally, Elena said what she'd come to say. "I need to understand how you did it." "Did what?" "Destroyed my husband's credibility in 3 weeks," Elena replied bluntly. "Victor had been winning every symbolic battle. He'd taken your territory, outspent you at every turn, made Salvatore look weak and irrelevant. And then, at his own mother's funeral, his entire extended family treated you like you belonged more than he did. I need to understand how you accomplished that." Lucia sipped her cappuccino before responding. "I didn't destroy Victor's credibility in 3 weeks, Elena. I spent 5 years positioning pieces on a board Victor didn't even know existed. The 3 weeks were just when I activated what I'd already built. Visiting his mother. Visiting a lonely old woman that everyone had forgotten about," Lucia corrected gently. "I didn't do it to hurt Victor. I did it because Catherine Castellano was alone and frightened and confused, and nobody should have to face dementia without someone who cares enough to show up." "But you knew it would matter eventually." "I knew faithfulness always matters eventually," Lucia replied. "I didn't know exactly when or how, but I knew that if I was faithful to Catherine, really faithful, not performing faithfulness but genuinely caring about her, that the family would remember. And when Victor finally pushed too far and humiliated my husband in ways that made community intervention necessary, the family's memory of my faithfulness would matter more than Victor's displays of wealth." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Victor is a good man," she said finally. "He built an empire from nothing. He's provided for his family. He's generous with his money, but he doesn't understand that power isn't just about resources. It's about relationships, and relationships can't be bought. They have to be earned through patient attention over time." "Victor is a bear," Lucia said. "Powerful, dramatic, impressive. Bears are important. Communities need bears to protect them, to provide for them, to demonstrate strength when threats emerge. But bears can't do everything. Sometimes you need a hummingbird." "Teach me," Elena said suddenly. "Teach me how to be a hummingbird instead of a bear." Lucia smiled. "You already know how. You're a prosecutor, Elena. You've spent your entire career understanding that cases aren't won through dramatic courtroom speeches. They're won through patient investigation, through talking to every witness, through visiting every scene, through accumulating details that nobody else bothers to document until suddenly you have an airtight case that can't be refuted." "But I don't know how to apply that to building community relationships." "Yes, you do," Lucia replied. "You just haven't been given permission to do it. Victor's style is dominating, grand gestures, dramatic displays, overwhelming opposition through superior resources. That works for some things, but it doesn't work for building the kind of deep community bonds that can survive symbolic warfare. For that, you need to do what prosecutors do: show up consistently, pay attention to details everyone else overlooks, build relationships based on genuine care rather than transactional generosity. "And you're willing to teach me this?" Elena asked, "even though our families are rivals." "Our husbands are rivals," Lucia corrected, "but we don't have to be. I'd rather have Elena Castellano learning to build community through patient attention than watching her husband continue making grand gestures that destabilize Corona's social fabric. Besides," she smiled, "hummingbirds don't compete with each other. The garden is big enough for multiple hummingbirds. It's the bears who insist there can only be one dominant alpha." They talked for another hour. Lucia explained her strategy: the Thursday visits with Catherine, the coffee meetings with business owners' wives, the lunch conversations with mothers and grandmothers who made the real social decisions in Corona families, the patient accumulation of relationships that nobody noticed until suddenly everyone noticed at exactly the right moment. Elena listened with the careful attention of someone who recognized she was receiving a masterclass in something she'd never been taught but desperately needed to learn. As they prepared to leave, Elena asked one final question. "Did Salvatore know about your plan?" "Not until it was already working," Lucia replied. "I needed him to genuinely believe he was being humiliated, genuinely appear defeated, genuinely play the role of a patriarch losing his grip on power. If he'd been acting, Victor would have noticed. Salvatore had to believe it was real for the deception to be complete." "That's ruthless," Elena observed. "That's necessary," Lucia corrected. "My husband is a good man, but he's a bear. He wants to roar when challenged. He wants to demonstrate strength through overwhelming force. Sometimes the best way to protect a bear is to let him think he's lost while the hummingbird wins the actual war." As they left the cafe, walking in opposite directions to their cars, Elena called back to Lucia. "Thursday afternoons, are you free?" "For what?" Lucia asked. "There's a nursing home in Woodside," Elena said, "full of elderly Italian immigrants who came to Queens in the 1950s and 60s. Most of them don't get visitors anymore. Their families are too busy. I thought maybe we could visit together, bring cookies, sit with people who are lonely. Not because it's strategic, just because it's right." Lucia smiled, the warm, genuine expression of someone who'd just discovered an unexpected ally. "I'm free every Thursday afternoon. I'll bring almond cookies from Rosa's. You bring whatever you think they'd like." "Thank you," Elena said, "for teaching me that power isn't just about being the loudest voice in the room." "Power is about being the one who shows up," Lucia replied, "week after week, with cookies, when nobody's watching and nobody's keeping score. That's when you build something that can't be taken away through grand gestures or dramatic displays. That's when you build something real." 2 weeks after Elena and Lucia began their Thursday nursing home visits, something remarkable happened in Corona. The 23 businesses that had received envelopes returning their protection payments quietly resumed paying the Morettis. Not because anyone demanded it, not because threats were made, but because the wives and mothers who ran the households behind those businesses had conversations with their husbands about which family actually cared about Corona. Antonio Parisi was the first. He approached Salvatore at Cafe Paradiso on a Tuesday morning and slid an envelope across the counter. "My February payment," Antonio said, "with apologies for the confusion. My wife reminded me that the Moretti family has been faithful to Corona for 40 years. That kind of faithfulness deserves loyalty in return." By the end of the week, all 23 businesses had resumed their Moretti payments. Victor heard about it, of course. But what could he say? That business owners shouldn't be allowed to choose which family they wanted to support. That his wife was somehow betraying him by visiting lonely old people in nursing homes with the Moretti matriarch. He couldn't complain without looking petty. Couldn't retaliate without violating the agreements both families had signed. Couldn't even articulate what had happened because the shift had been so subtle, so quiet, so thoroughly based on relationship rather than transaction. The bear had been outmaneuvered by the hummingbird, and the most beautiful part, the detail that made Salvatore finally understand the full genius of his wife's strategy, was that Victor never figured out how it happened. He knew he'd lost. He knew the extended Castellano family now viewed Lucia with more respect than they viewed him. He knew Corona's businesses had chosen the Morettis over his displays of superior generosity, but he didn't understand why. Because Victor was a bear, and bears don't see hummingbirds. 6 months later, a conversation at the Moretti dinner table. "Nonna," Sophia asked, watching Lucia prepare her usual oversized pot of soup. "Why do you always make so much soup? We can't eat all of it." Lucia smiled at her 8-year-old granddaughter. "Because soup needs time to develop flavor. You can't rush it. You have to let it simmer slowly, adding ingredients one at a time, stirring patiently while the flavors blend and deepen." "But that doesn't explain why you make so much," Sophia persisted. "Because the best soup is made with the intention of sharing," Lucia replied. "You make a big pot knowing you'll bring bowls to neighbors, share with friends, feed people who stop by unexpectedly. Soup made only for yourself never tastes as good as soup made with the intention of nourishing your community." She stirred the pot thoughtfully. "And sometimes, Sophia, the most important battles aren't won through being the strongest, or the loudest, or the most dramatic. Sometimes they're won through patient attention, through showing up every day with something warm to share, through caring about people who everyone else has forgotten." "Like visiting Grandpa Victor's mom?" Sophia asked. "Like visiting anyone who's lonely," Lucia corrected gently. "Not because it's strategic, not because you expect something in return, but because the only way to build a community that lasts is to tend it like a garden, one flower at a time. So quietly that nobody notices until suddenly everything has bloomed and the entire garden is beautiful." Sophia considered this. "So you're like a gardener?" "No, sweetheart," Lucia replied, smiling at the metaphor Salvatore had learned to understand only recently. "I'm like a hummingbird, small, quiet, easy to overlook. But I visit every flower, one at a time, and before anyone realizes what's happened, the entire garden has been pollinated and changed completely." "That's a weird superpower, Nonna," Lucia laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "The best superpowers usually are. The loud, dramatic ones are easy to understand, but also easy to defend against. The quiet, patient ones are invisible until suddenly they're unstoppable." From across the kitchen, Salvatore watched his wife teach their granddaughter about power, strategy, and the patient work of building something that couldn't be destroyed through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. He'd spent 48 years married to this woman, and he was still learning that the most dangerous people in any room aren't the ones who roar the loudest. They're the ones who visit every flower in the garden with such quiet faithfulness that nobody notices they're the reason everything bloomed.